Hey folks, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, you can unlock unlimited access to political news, commentary, opinion, and a whole lot more at inforum.news/port for only 99 cents a month for your first 3 months. Hurry, get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk, and of course, happy to be with you. I hope you're all staying warm out there. We're getting a nice dose of February in North Dakota. It's not even weather. We should just expect this. I don't understand what everybody's complaining about. I do feel sorry for those poor saps down in Arizona who have this boring 75 degrees every day. Come on. I want to wake up in the morning and be attacked by the weather. I want to not know even what's coming, right? I like a little variety in my life.
Rob Port, wrong again.
Wrong once again. No, absolutely 100% right. All right, so let's, we're going to be starting the podcast here in a moment. Our guest is North Dakota Superintendent Kirsten Baesler, and we're going to talk with her a little bit because her and Governor Burgum, my company had an editorial about some of our struggles. I mean, teachers are feeling burned out. They're feeling tired. There's a lot of challenges there. Exacerbated, obviously, I think, by the times we're living in, whether it's politics, whether it's the pandemic. And, you know, I think there's a lot of people talking about what can we do in terms of keeping those teachers on. Governor Burgum and Superintendent Baesler, you know, wrote sort of a response to that. And that's why we wanted to have the superintendent on today. And Kirsten, first of all, thanks for your time. Second of all, tell us a little bit about this problem. I mean, from your point of view as our state's top educator.
Sure. Well, first of all, I appreciate being on the show to talk about this conversation. I appreciate the forum's editorial asking the state, the governor as the leader of our state and the state superintendent as the leader of K-12 education to step in and take action, acknowledge that this is an issue. So first and foremost, I've always been one that, you know, is supported the understanding that you can't solve a problem unless you acknowledge that there is a problem and that you commit to finding solutions. So there is a problem, and we need to commit to finding solutions to it. So, you know, and this isn't a problem that developed or happened overnight, Rob. This has been a problem in the making, and the pandemic has exacerbated the problem, in my opinion. I think that teachers have been taking on more and more and more over the last decade. They've been asked to do more and more, and because they're so committed to their students, to the students' families, to their schools, and to their communities as a whole, they have taken on those extra challenges, those extra responsibilities with great heroism. The last 3 years, this is our third school year that we've been engaged with the pandemic. It was February, March of 2020. I had a full, you know, the last 9 weeks of that school year, a full year last year, and now almost a full year this year. So in addition to all of the other responsibilities that our teachers and paraprofessionals and bus drivers, and when I say educators, I'm talking about people from the boardrooms all the way down to the crossing guards. When I say educators, they've all been experiencing things that have been unprecedented. And so they've been taking on more in the last decade than normal. But now with the pandemic, they have been so overwhelmed with being responsible for their primary mission of educating our young people and keeping public health as part of their primary mission. And you cannot expect a small number of people to carry two priority primary missions within a community for this number of years without them feeling the fatigue and duress that they're feeling at this point. And so I'm glad that we're talking about it. I hope that this isn't just a one cycle spin in the news. I hope that, because if we're really going to solve this problem, we have to commit to, it took us several years, many, many years for us to get into this position. It's going to take some concerted effort and some time and commitment to help reverse that trend.
Hey, Kirsten, Chad Oban here. Rob forgot to introduce his co-host for this podcast. And while I recognize the listeners 100% recognize my voice, I just thought I should make sure that they know that Chad Oban is here too. I too appreciate having this conversation. And I know, I think one of the things that's lost is people often think this is pandemic related. But you and I have spent time in rooms on task force talking about this issue long before the pandemic started. And often the focus there was on recruitment, on really recruiting more people into the profession. That was where the focus is. Once we get them in the classroom, they're going to stay if we can make those first 5 years good. And that was a lot of the focus of the editorial from you and Governor Burgum. I think that we've had a shift here to a certain extent towards more retention, in even more so than recruitment. We have to do both. There's no doubt about that. But you and I talked recently about the Kelly Suki op-ed in the Bismarck Tribune. She's an educator here in Bismarck who talked about her experience as an elementary school teacher in Bismarck. And the things that she's facing are not things that will be fixed at one board negotiation or one legislative session or you and the governor by themselves. She was really calling on the community to step up. So can you talk a little bit about the retention piece? Because it seems like a lot of the points you had with the governor were about recruitment of people into the profession.
They were. So the majority of the points that were listed, and I know that the response to the editorial may have seemed a bit defensive, and I could see how it could come off like that. I want to take this opportunity to share with both of you that while I know that it may have appeared that way, it wasn't intended to be the sole message of that response. We felt that it was important that the listeners, that the readers knew that there were actual steps taken to address the recruitment, as you mentioned. One of the things that was mentioned in there that we take great pride in at the Department of Public Instruction, though, was the North Dakota Teacher of the Year. When a decade ago, we maybe had a dozen teachers that were nominated or applied for the State Teacher of the Year. This year we have over 350 nominations or applications for teachers from 48 of our counties. That program is intended to lift up the profession of education, to exalt it, to celebrate it, and to recognize the real quality educators. We have to do that, and that's something that the state is doing. But to your point, Chad, I'm going to go back and just say that, yeah, it was almost a decade ago where my first term in office, where we had a task force put together to really identify the teacher shortage that was looming in our state that we knew was happening a decade ago. We worked with the university systems, and what we found is that our university systems were actually graduating enough teacher education degree people to replace the retirees in our state. But the majority of our teachers weren't willing to go to those smaller communities, and they had gone to college in a Fargo or a Grand Forks or a Minot and wanted to stay in those communities or go to a large community. So at that point, it was a recruitment issue. But recently, it has turned to recruitment is still an issue. We can't take our foot off the gas on that. But we also need to retain the teachers and make sure that the conditions are good and that we're celebrating and recognizing them for the professionals that they are. I really, I want to say that understanding space issues for letters to the editor and understanding the constraints of print newspapers, there were 2 paragraphs in the response that the governor and I drafted and sent to the forum that didn't make it into the print version or the online version. And I think if I can just share those with you both today, I think it's an important piece because it was the piece that I added and felt the most strongly about. And that the first paragraph begins with, local leaders must prioritize budgets so that the significant state K-12 funding is invested in the teachers and paraprofessionals who work with students. They must create policies that reward and recognize the teaching profession. Then I go on to say, community and family members must support and encourage the partnership between school and home, and honor and respect the education profession within their own homes. And I think those are 2 critical pieces as we talk about retention and talk about, often we talk about money. Teachers don't often talk to me about more money when they share their struggles. Obviously, they want to make sure that their own children have enough to go to college and that they're able to, support their own families. But money is not the source of the conversation when I talk to our state teachers of the year or the nominees for those the best of the best pro teachers in our state. They talk about that respect. They talk about the never-ending work days that they're willing to do, but then feeling that sometimes rather than a partnership between school and home, that they feel that they're on an island all by themselves and not supported by the very people in the very communities that they're working to help support and lift up.
I want to take a moment here and introduce my co-host, Chad Oban, just real quick, who co-hosts with me on Wednesdays. He's going to be a big baby about it. I'm kidding. Kirsten, how much? It's interesting to me because I think when we all tend, Chad and I do politics for a living. You do politics for a living, really, and it's all about ultimately having a debate and creating public policy. That's what it's supposed to be about. But I'm looking at this problem, and I think you guys are right. I mean, there was a pre-existing problem that was exacerbated by what we've been through with the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of what I'm hearing here is trying to encourage the community to, and I don't know what the right would be, more respectful of educators, forge a better relationship with educators. And first of all, I don't know what the public policy solution is for that, to tell people, be more cooperative, be nicer, be more patient. And also, I don't think that that's a problem that's unique to education. I think it's a problem. Retail workers are going to tell you that they have the same problem, that they are also feeling burned out, that they are feeling like they don't have any cooperation from their customers because the minute, one little thing goes wrong, it's like people are walking into the store looking for something to be upset about. I think educators probably feel that way, and school board members and administrators feel that way, where parents are walking into the school building or walking into whatever interaction they're going to have with the educators looking for a reason to be upset. I'm a little flummoxed because I don't know, and maybe you can help illuminate this. I don't know what the public policy solution is for that.
So I think you're spot on, Rob. I think you are. As we talk, yes, we're all involved in politics. And one of the things that, I've learned through public policy and through education is, and been reaffirmed situation after situation, experience after experience, you have to assume positive intent. And when you can assume positive intent, whether it was in my role as a vice principal within the Bismarck school system or within my own classroom as a teacher, and now within the office of the state superintendent, whether I'm working with constituents or policymakers, local leaders, state leaders, when you enter into a conversation, assuming positive intent with an asset-based mindset, things do get done more effectively with better solutions. But I have seen an erosion of that in almost every arena, whether it's policymaking, politics, or education. And I don't know that you can, there is that saying, you can't legislate your way into good behavior or good decisions, right? But as the state superintendent that's responsible for people that can't even vote and are 0 to 18, or specifically 5 years old to 18 years old, I have a front row seat to view this generation of young people watching us and waiting for us to set the table for them to be successful. This is my 30th year in education. In fact, it's my 31st year in education. And I haven't seen a generation that is more committed to not only being happy themselves, but actually to contributing to their greater good of their communities. So this generation, a lot of people beat up on them and say that they're selfish, and I'm not seeing that. I have a student cabinet that I meet quarterly with. They are really wanting to engage and be part of the solution, but they're watching us as adults act and behave badly. And I don't know that there is a policy that we can, as a state, can do. And maybe that was the full intent of my message in this response to the letter to the editor, is that, yes, there are some policy things that we can do as a state, but until we all commit to solving this problem individually, it begins with us at home. We can't look to others or specifically state policy to solve this problem.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back a little bit on the idea that there's no policy that affects this. I would suggest that policymakers should stop doing harm. One of the things that we saw in our polling was public school teachers feel like they're political footballs, be it trans cameras that they want to have in classrooms, the CRT bill that isn't taking place, the voucher bills when people stand up and talk about how terrible public schools are, the talk shows in Bismarck who get paid to talk show hosts in Bismarck who get paid to work on policy and currently are making up things about our public schools in Bismarck to cause chaos. Those are things that, they're not a policy, but policymakers and people in this arena could start fixing right now, rather than trying to fix things that they hear about on Tucker Carlson that aren't happening here. Spend some time in a school and figure out what's going on. So I agree with both of you. There's not a policy solution to be nice, but there is stop doing harm. Stop saying things just because you heard about it on Tucker Carlson.
But before the superintendent answer, I want to push back a little bit and say proposing policy ideas that North Dakota United doesn't like is not necessarily part of the problem. We can have a debate about vouchers or school choice policy or some of these other things without it being, the problem is we don't know how to talk or disagree with one another, I think is.
Rob, I agree 100% with that.
Okay.
It's not the policy discussion that's the problem. It's the things that are said during that policy discussion. The conversation you and I had with the guy from NDSU about choice, we can have that conversation. Sure. But it's when you have the conversation that's saying, oh my gosh, there is some secret thing happening at Horizon Middle School, and therefore we have to shut down the public schools to have vouchers. I mean, that's the problem.
Well, I think that was the superintendent's point, where it's just we don't know how to disagree with one another and get to a point where we can have a conversation without needing the other side to not just be wrong but like evil in some way.
Yeah.
And that's our young people are craving that opportunity. Think back about, I would assume because of the work that the three of us are in, I loved those debates that I had in my small town, classroom. And we were, sometimes we thought collectively, there were all 28 of us in my graduating class, right? Sometimes we thought collectively about an issue, and sometimes we were vehemently in opposite corners. But we were all from that community, and I cherish those moments, and I long for those debates that I was able to have when I was in middle school and high school, guided by not only my parents' viewpoints at home, but also my classmates' viewpoints in school, guided by a teacher. This generation of young people are not being granted that opportunity because for whatever reason, our communities are becoming more and more suspicious of having young people being allowed to have those debates and let it play out. I think you're both saying the same thing, but Chad, I'm going to push back and say yes, policymakers can do no harm. We can my colleagues downstairs in the chambers of the Senate and the House, they could have those policy debates and refuse. But the thing about it is the root cause is their constituents. And that's why I say it begins in the homes of each and every one of us. None of those policy debates would come to the Capitol halls, whether they be in our state Capitol halls or our nation's Capitol halls, unless constituents bring them. And so let's start at home and not say to to our 47 senators that they just have to ignore their constituents, because they have to go back home, and these conversations are happening in their grocery stores, in their church halls, and at basketball games. It has to begin at home.
But I think, Kirsten, you've got sort of a chicken and egg situation, right? So the constituents bring something to a legislator. Sometimes legislators have to say, that's not a real issue. That's not really happening here, because often then when it gets brought to the Capitol, it feeds oxygen to the people around the countryside to be even more radical and crazy about the terrible stuff happening in our public schools, right? So, I mean, I agree. I mean, these legislators aren't just coming up with these ideas on their own or telling the anecdotal stories that often are true on their own, but it has to be both. So I agree with you, but I think the policymaker does have a role in it.
And I think to your point that I think is true, I think K-12 educational issues have been brought into that football arena more and more frequently in the last 5 to 8 years.
Well, you can look at, there's a whole genre of like cable news story that is some kid didn't get to wear his NRA t-shirt, or some kid didn't get to wear their Black Lives Matter t-shirt. And then that feeds into, because of this anecdote, and maybe, I don't know, maybe the local officials were too draconian or not draconian. I don't know. But they take this anecdote and they cherry pick it. They put it in front of a national audience, and then they say, see how evil your school educators are. Even though what's going on happening in the Pasadena school district really has no bearing on what's happening in Bismarck or Fargo or Minot. But yet, everything becomes part of this national narrative. Look what the schools are doing because this kid had some problem with their t-shirt. There's a whole, that's probably my industry's problem, because those stories drive clicks. But even there, it's a constituency thing. What do people want to read? Well, they want to be outraged by some kid who can't wear their NRA t-shirt, right? Or their Black Lives Matter, or their, whatever. They want to be outraged by some scandal somewhere. And it doesn't matter. There's a unquenchable thirst for outrage in the American public. And if there's nothing outrageous happening, heck, we'll make it up.
I think that's true. But let's not, again, I'm gonna say this generation isn't that special. Think back about, there were political issues that were occurring in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and the 80s, and the 90s. It was happening all over, and you have a group of young people that, are destined to be teenagers, and they're going to push the envelope. But what is different is if it were a juried media, if it were, as it was in the 70s, the 80s, where it took a lot more to get your opinion in print, or a lot more to get your opinion broadcast. But now you can truly have an opinion, and it doesn't even need to be on a news service. It can just be a social media story.
That's usually, by the time the news media picks some of these stuff up, it's because some parent somewhere has already got 10,000 people following them on Facebook, making the deal. So that, like, in a lot of ways, the news media follows that as well, because it's like, well, this is what people are talking about. We'll jump into the fray too, and part of that, that's not necessarily wrong. Part of that's just our jobs. Chad's got a question.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a question. I do have a comment about what Kirsten just said. She's absolutely right. Since the beginning of time, teenagers have been doing stuff that old people think is weird.
Right.
Right? Since the beginning of time. Now, when teenagers do weird stuff, they tell their friends go home, their parents get outraged, they go on cable news or talk radio, they go on social media. Next thing you know, there's 20 parents at a public school saying, why are you letting this kid be weird? Right? It is that outrage sort of thing. But I want to go back to, Kirsten, you said that teachers, it's not necessarily about money. And I saw Rob smirk at me when you were saying that. I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but
yeah, that's just how my face looks.
Okay. One of the things that I would say about that is, I think you're right. No teacher is saying, I'm going to become a teacher because I want to get rich, right? Everybody knows that. But we also know in society that you want to be appreciated. And part of the way we feel appreciated is through a paycheck. And I would just say, last session, when the legislature did a 1% increase, with 70% of that was dedicated to teacher salaries. So it's about a 0.7% salary increase at a time where I'm going to walk into something here when inflation was 5.5%, 7.5% last year. Part of it is about money. Part of it is about making ends meet, not having to work a second job in order to pay your mortgage and those kind of things. That creates burnout in a lot of things as well. So I don't think we can just say, dismiss the money part of it, because that has to be part of the conversation.
I agree. And, maybe that is you always, we Monday morning quarterback. Each time you write something, you read it in a different light the next day and think, oh, I wish I'd have said that differently. I think part of that, one of the first 2 bullet points talking about the significant state investment of the $2.13 billion, and then saying that 1% was dedicated. It gave the impression that 1% of $2.13 billion was dedicated, and actually it was just the 1% of this that biennium increase was requested, and that's why I think the point of that was with the $2.13 billion. And I will tell, when I took office, we had not even been making, it was $900 million was the investment in K-12 a decade ago. So fast forward 10 years, we went from 900 million to 2.13 billion that's delivered out to our local school districts. And so I think, yes, there's bigger needs, there's more mental and behavioral health. Schools need to take on more. But I think the point was, when we deliver that out to our local school boards, we need to ensure that local citizens are engaging with how that money is being spent at that local level, because the state has significantly upped their commitment. And I say this often, I feel grateful that I live and lead education in the state of North Dakota, because historically, our legislature has supported K-12 education and understood the value of it when other states haven't done that. But with that being said, you have to make enough. We don't need to be rich, but you have to make enough that your family is taken care of and that you don't have to go without, or your children don't have to go without. It was interesting. I was involved in a conversation, invited to a conversation led by the Department of Human Services yesterday and our state leaders, as they're talking about this child care crisis. Every industry, as Rob pointed out, is facing challenges and workforce shortage issues. And so part of that solution needs to be childcare, so we're not eliminating half of our families that are, if you're a second wage earner and you're only making 35, 45,000, it doesn't make sense for you to go to work if you have 3 children under the age of 5, or even 2 children under the age of 5, and your entire paycheck is going to childcare. It was interesting as we started looking at occupations that are hard to fill occupations, according to the Department of Commerce. And like the second or third tier up was school counselors and school teachers, that they were included in those employees in our state that weren't making enough to make it quite economically feasible for that family to have that teacher enter into the workforce as they're considering childcare. And so there's a lot that it's a complex issue. That's why everybody needs to be part of solving this.
Yeah, and Kirsten, I would just add to how great it is to work in public education in North Dakota and the investment that the state is making. It's always been bipartisan support. Public education until the last probably couple cycles has really been not even nonpartisan when it comes to delivering for your public schools back home. And I think what we've seen, and maybe probably at the beginning of the pandemic with masks and all the other stuff, it has seemed to get more partisan in terms of how we talk about public education.
I guess from just to build on Chad's point, I think that brings it back to my point that I made earlier. I think our society, North Dakota and the country, is we're struggling with finding trust in our institutions, whether it's the news media, whether it's education, whether it's government, law enforcement. I mean, across the board, we have a problem with our institutions right now. And I think this is a facet of that larger problem. And again, I think it's as frustrating as the answer is, it's like we just have to choose to do this better. Like we as a society have to choose to do this better. Stop ignoring the people, start ignoring, the people who are out there spreading falsehoods and rabble rousing and just trying to create friction for the sake of creating friction. Listen, the normal process creates plenty of friction. We don't need to invent new frictions.
Right.
But to me, that's how I'm looking at this issue. And again, I'm not saying that to be dismissive of it or of any of the other problems. I'm just saying that to me is central. I don't know how we rebuild respect in our institutions, K through 12 public education being one of them.
And we've talked about media, we've talked about K-12 education. I know that you have talked about on this podcast and written about just the dissension in the politics or the policy side. And so, whether you use the word institution or establishment, which is, there is such a push against all things that have been established and tried and tested. But I guess one of the points that I think is important when I talk about this is, as soon as you become in a position of power, you've become establishment. I don't care how much of an outsider you were. As soon as you are elected or as soon as you are hired to lead a school, you suddenly become establishment. And so if we have this constant assault on institutions that have proven track records, or established lawmakers that have proven track records, voting well, making sure the noise is not the main thing, that the main thing is the main thing, how do we ever get ourselves out of this hole that we've dug? But these conversations, the fact that we're talking about it in a podcast, that it's being written about, is important, because there is the tendency to think that real loud noise of people not respecting public education or not respecting thoughtful lawmakers that vote on issues, we tend to think that we're the only ones. So until we start to stand up and say, oh no, I feel that way too, we're not going to be able to beat against that drumbeat.
Well, on that note, I thank you so much for your time. You promised us 30 minutes. We got 30 minutes. So I really appreciate your time, Kirsten.
Thank you.
Thanks,
for
Kirsten.
having this conversation. Take care.
Well, we just finished up our interview with Superintendent Kirsten Baesler, and I think really that interview is I mean, the roots of it are in the very thing that we're going to talk about next, which is, in fact, we're going to talk a little bit about Senator John Hoeven, who is facing a primary challenge from State Representative Rick Becker, and maybe going to skip the NDGOP convention. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But Chad, what you just told me off air, we were off air for a couple of minutes while Baesler left the program. But what you were just telling me is how do we get people to care about fact from fiction? How do we get them to stop ignoring what I would describe as arsonists, right? Like they're just out there to set bonfires, and it's like they don't really care if it's accurate. They're not really trying to make a principled argument. They're just trying to draw a crowd in the same way that car accidents draw a crowd or a burning house draws a crowd. I don't know how to address the public's appetite for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're never going to get to a point where the people trust the institutions or the establishment until the people can start figuring out the difference between fact and fiction. And one of my frustrations is so often, I saw it during the last legislative session for the first time, where the fiction from cable news, talk radio, social media was coming to the Capitol, right? I mean, it was people testifying, and like there wasn't elected officials, I think, have to be able to be one of the umpires when it comes to fact versus fiction in terms of society. And they have to understand there are people who are paid to rabble-rouse, to stir things up, and to entertain us. That doesn't make good policy. If people are being paid to entertain us, that's not good policy. And you said it earlier. I mean, what gets clicks, what gets listened to? It's when people want to be outraged, you're going to give them something to be outraged about. And
I would argue there's plenty of true factual things to be outraged about. Like, you don't have to make things up. There's actual it's just it's harder work to find those things. And I mean, listen, I that's my industry, right? I make a living from that. I write things that I want people to read. I always laugh when people accuse me of clickbait. Like, what am I supposed to? I'm supposed to write things you don't want to click on. Everything's supposed to be. But I mean, clickbait, I think, being something where I misled you. Like, I wrote a headline that's not really supported by maybe the article, or I made a claim that's not really supported by the facts. I mean, that's the bad kind. I mean, listen, I see my job as trying to help people understand things. Now, along the way, obviously, I make arguments, and I have an ideology, or I have a philosophy, I have a preference, and I express that, and I'm not shy about it. But I publish documents. I talk to people. I try to help people know things that they might not have known otherwise, or maybe understand things in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise. I want people, when they reach the end of one of my columns or one of my podcasts or whatever, I hope that even if they maybe disagree with my conclusions, I hope that they still found the experience valuable. Like, that's my goal. I'm not sure how many other, and I think there's other people out there who are trying to do the same thing, but I think some of the loudest voices are not, Chad. I don't think they care. I think it's just whatever I can say to make the phone lines light up today, whatever I could say to make the real-time traffic meters on the website peg. That's all they care about.
And that's what people want. I mean, there's a significant segment of our population that, like you said, wants to be outraged. And, you know, we've talked a lot about what's going on with the GOP and district conventions, and we've had more in the last week or so where, you know, the outsider, the Bastiats won. And I'm starting to think this has nothing to do with ideology. This has nothing to do with specific votes. If you are part of what a group of people perceive as part of the establishment, so if you've ever been elected before, or if you're connected to people who are elected, we don't like you and we're going to throw you out, no matter how flawed the challenger is.
Right. Well, and that's, I mean, honestly, I think that's a lot of the motivation behind like the term limits ballot measure, where it doesn't matter if maybe the person who's been there in the legislature, for instance, because the measure would create a 2-term limit for state lawmakers, 8 years. So it doesn't matter if the person who's been there for 8 years is doing a really good job and is popular with their constituents. By law, they can't run for that office again, you know, on the assumption that just by having been there, now they're tainted. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. All right, so let's talk about Senator John Hoeven. Possibly. Now, I'm obviously the source for this, and I can tell you it's on the table. It's a real possibility, and I think the Hoeven campaign's taken some public actions that make it pretty clear that it's on the table. They're polling their delegates. I mean, they're worried about the delegate count. So Hoeven's thinking about maybe skipping the state convention, the state endorsing conventions. And for those of you who don't understand how this works, the political parties hold conventions. First, they hold them locally, and then those to endorse like legislative candidates, and then those local conventions send delegates to the state convention who endorse candidates for the statewide ballot. But none of it really matters until the June primary. That's the vote that matters. So what Hoeven's considering is not going to the state convention, where a relatively small number of activists are going to vote on the endorsement, but instead just going straight to the primary, where the larger electorate is going to vote. If you were managing John Hoeven's campaign, Chad, what's the advice you would give him?
Skip it. I mean, here's the thing. Even if he goes in there and, all indications that I've heard from talking to people on the GOP side of things is John Hoeven's not going to get 90% of the delegates. He's not going to get 80% of the delegates. If he wins at the convention, it's going to be like a 60%, 55%.
I don't think at this point, I don't think it would even be like on the first ballot. Right.
Yeah. And so you look at that. And so the question is, what's the upside? There's no way John Hoeven comes out of that convention in better shape than he goes into it. I mean, either Rick Becker gets 40, 50%, 45% of the vote, and it makes John Hoeven like a super popular long-term incumbent look weak. I mean, if I were him, skip it.
I think I would give the same advice. And my argument would be all the points that you made, but then also the intangibles. How many boo birds does it take in the audience to make a headline, right? That this super popular, multiple term incumbent who consistently wins more than 70% on the statewide ballot got booed at his own party's convention, or had other things, other stunts happen. That is the tactic from this faction, the sort of the Becker faction, the Bastiat faction, whatever you want to, the Patriot, that's the other thing, the Patriot movement that they call themselves sometimes. For instance, I wrote a column, I published it just before we began recording this, about a guy who's very much in that faction, very much a pro-Trump guy. He's appeared on the ballot in the past as a candidate for very kind of a fringy candidate, Michael Coachman. And he tried to citizens arrest the Grand Forks City Council. And if you have to go watch this video because it is absolutely surreal to watch this guy. But the thing is that's the tactic, right? That's the stunt. So, I mean, does John Hoeven want to stunt like that? As ultimately meaningless as it might be, it's going to make headlines. So I think that's even another argument to skip the convention. And then the other argument I think you can make is there is a growing gap, I think, between what, the sort of candidates that are getting the endorsement from the convention process and what the larger electorate is going to find palatable in a candidate, right? I think candidates like Rick Becker do very, very well in the convention process because it's the hardcores, right? It's the hardcore activists, and they're I mean, it's easy to pack a room, right? If you're good at Facebook and you have, you're sort of catering to a very active, very vocal community, it's easy to pack a room. But is that really the way to endorse the best candidates? I think you can start looking at some of these results and say, no, it's not. There's a gap here.
But at some point we have to ask the question, if it's so easy to pack a room,
why isn't Hoeven doing it?
Yeah. Why isn't Hoeven doing it? And I keep thinking about this, and you and I've talked about it. during the North Dakota legislature, they throw the Bastiats a bone on masks, on vaccines, on all these different things, somehow thinking it's going to calm people down. It never does. It pours fuel on their fire to ask for more. John Hoeven appeared at the Stop the Steal rally at the state capitol after the election in front of all these people who are now trying to defeat him. I assume under the idea of, if I do these kind of things, these people will calm down. He
voted against impeachment. He consistently voted against the January 6th investigation stuff. Like, he's not. I'm trying to think of the vote other than voting to certify the election, right? Which our entire congressional delegation ultimately did. I'm trying to think of the vote or the thing that John Hoeven has said that has made sort of Trump world upset at him, that's made him not good enough. And I think John Hoeven's great is that he's quiet.
Yeah,
he's quiet.
Well, and here's the deal. From my perspective, he's voted against every Biden appointment or close to, right? He voted for every Trump appointment or close to, even Betsy DeVos.
How is this not good enough?
Yeah, and so that is the question. You and I spoke earlier before we went on air about the moving goalposts. What these moderate Republicans, they're not even moderates, right? They're conservatives in any other generation. When are they going to figure out that no matter what they do, the people who are angry at the establishment, who are angry at the people in power, are never going to be happy?
Right.
I mean, they've been mad at Kevin Cramer for things in the past. I mean, for goodness sake,
the vote on the infrastructure bill. So that was a really interesting dynamic, right? Because from my perspective, the senators had to vote for that because it wasn't just the infrastructure bill, which I think we could go through, and probably conservatives find a lot of things they don't like. But the reality is, Democrats controlled the Senate. The reality is, a lot of Senate Democrats were pushing for a hell of a lot more spending than what they got. And the bulwark holding that spending back was two Democratic senators, really, Joe Manchin from West Virginia and Kristen Sinema. So our senators, I thought, made a very calculated vote. We're not going to stab Manchin and Sinema in the back on this infrastructure bill that we negotiated with them. Because if we stab them in the back, then why should they keep standing up to support the filibuster? Why should they keep standing up to oppose these larger spending bills? Like, I mean, to me, that was a very defensible conservative move. Sometimes you go to war with the Congress you have, not the Congress you wish you had. So in that context, they made the right vote.
I've never understood the criticism of elected officials in North Dakota bringing home the bacon. Right, bringing home the money for flood protection. I mean, Hoeven made the point when he was on with us, it keeps property taxes low in Minot and Fargo and other places. If they're not at the table negotiating for North Dakota, that money's likely going somewhere, and it's not North Dakota.
So I was one of those people who was like, ban the earmarks, get rid of them, and the argument was a fiscal conservative argument. Our national debt's out of control. We got to stop this stuff. Our national debt's still out. We banned earmarks. Our national debt's worse than ever. The earmarks weren't the spending problem. The spending problem lays elsewhere in spending line items that we don't really want to debate about. Things like, Medicare, right? I mean, that's really, but those debates are intractable. So instead we talk about, so-and-so, got airport money or something, which is a rounding error in the national budget. So, I was part of that, and I've come around on it, right? I kind of want to, and part of it also is, that the earmarks greased the skids in Washington, right? I mean,
it made people work together.
Those were the horses they could trade so that people would work together. And now we eliminated them, and we ought to bring them back. So I agree with you there, but bringing it back again, I'm looking at John Hoeven's record as a United States Senator, and I'm thinking, where is the problem, right? I mean, if the problem is that he's not Tucker Carlson throwing bombs or he's not Rand Paul, right? Let's use a better example. He's not Rand Paul, who's going to insult Anthony Fauci and everything else. On policy, he's not that far from Rand Paul. He's just not bombastic, right? He's not out in front of a microphone. That to me looks like his only sin, and for that, he's got to face a challenge from Rick Becker.
Well, and from my perspective, John Hoeven has become much more conservative since going to Washington than he was here as a governor.
Which, from my perspective, has been great. I think he's been a much better senator than he was a governor.
It's been a terrible thing that I wish John Hoeven was a little more progressive when it comes to things in Washington. But I think the other thing, Rob, that you put in your column that's interesting is, so let's say Hoeven pulls the plug and says,
Sure.
I'm not going to the convention. My first question is, did Hoeven support the resolution to move the endorsing convention until after the primary? Was he part of that discussion? I'm guessing he wishes he was now,
right,
to push for that. But secondly, what do the other statewide candidates do? Does the endorsement from a convention that wouldn't nominate or wouldn't endorse John Hoeven, is that endorsement worth anything to Kelly Armstrong and Michael Howe and Drew Wrigley? And these other folks? I mean, how do they handle this? And if John Hoeven says, let's all go, come on, guys, let's go, do they follow? Where's their loyalty?
I don't, to your first question, I don't know where Hoeven was at on that. I mean, that was a decision made by the state committee of the NDGOP. Now, obviously, the delegation and the governor and those other elected officials, they have some degree of influence and can certainly lobby, one way or the other. I don't think Hoeven did anything. I mean, I didn't hear about Burgum was kind of the big mover and shaker and behind that. But you're right. I think Hoeven maybe is finally starting to realize there's a real problem here where our convention process, the Republican Party convention process, is not producing the sort of candidates that are going to contribute to the NDGOP continuing to be a dominant party. Because I'm telling you, if they continue to look foolish, the fortunes of the NDGOP can change very quickly. Even as out of it as down on the mat as the Dem NPL seems right now, and are as a matter of fact, that could switch very, very quickly. But then the other point is, what do the other statewides do? For one thing, John Hoeven's not known to be especially generous with in terms of getting in, and I mean, he hasn't done a lot of things, other than just sort of the rote political things that one Republican's going to do for another Republican. He's not exactly ever reached down the ballot and helped a lot of these folks out. And so they may be thinking, why should I, in the short term, why should I, give you political cover and invite problems for myself that I don't need? But I think they need to think about this more long term, right? You need to think about this more long term, because this could be your problem in the next election. Like Kelly Armstrong, this could be your problem in the next election cycle, right? This could be your problem, Doug Burgum or whoever else. Like if you don't, and obviously Doug Burgum's not on the ballot this year, so he's not. But you other statewide, Drew Wrigley, I mean, this could be your problem too, and you need to be thinking about that.
Well, but so what's the solution? I mean, you don't show up at the convention, you poke all these folks in the eye. If you're Drew Wrigley, you haven't really been on their radar as somebody who's bad from their perspective.
If anything, Drew Wrigley was on their radar because he was maybe gonna run against Wayne Stenjum and challenge him in a primary, and Drew would have been the outsider, right, against the establishment, right up until the point he got elected attorney general and didn't join some lawsuit challenging the outcome of the election, and then they turn on him.
Well, and I think so many of the down ballot Republicans have done a pretty good job of staying out of the fray when it comes to this fight, sort of having people on both sides. You start opting out of the state convention, that changes. You're now in the fray. And so I think they need to think about that. The other thing that I think is hard for a U.S. Senator, and I think it happened with Kent Conrad and Byron Dorgan, when you have a 6-year term and you're working in Washington, it is hard to maintain those relationships at the district level. And with the way the North Dakota GOP is changing so rapidly, the North Dakota GOP, the last time John Hoeven was on the ballot compared to now, it's a different world. And if he didn't maintain those relationships through that time, I mean, it makes sense that Marcella, his daughter, didn't get elected to be a convention delegate, or his family or surrogates aren't getting good responses at these district conventions. Again, 6 years is a long time.
It is, and that's fair. I guess the other thing is the NDGOP. I mean, if you just wave bye-bye to the convention process and say we're just going to do everything in June now, which is kind of what they wanted to do, at least with the statewide convention earlier this year, that's a risk too, right? I mean, you talk about losing connection with some of the activists. If you're not holding those local conventions, or if you're holding them but they're not meaningful because there's no real competition and there's no heat there, it's just sort of a ceremonial thing after the June primary, you're going to lose connection with some of those activists, which is hard, which really I think is why I started this saying this debate has its roots in what we just talked about with the superintendent. Is the problem is there's a large minority of the NDGOP base that is off the rails. That's reality right now. That's why state lawmakers who maybe don't like the bills that they're introducing sometimes are introducing them anyway, because they have large constituencies that are for the bills and they don't want to lose re-election, right? They don't want to invite that headache. And that's what's happening. And I don't know how to change that. I don't know how to change that. That's where a lot of these folks are going. I
used to say, is a legislative seat worth that much? That you're willing to introduce a bill or vote for a bill that you're fundamentally against. And I used to get some pushback, mostly from Republicans saying, well, yeah, but if not me, who's coming in behind me? I'm doing this so I can maintain the seat, so I can do this other really important work over here. If I'm not in this seat, if I lose, it's going to be somebody who doesn't do this important work, and all they do is focus on the messaging bills, the crazy bills all the time.
Which is a fair argument.
So I think a lot of the moderate Republicans feel a lot of pressure to stay in those seats, even though I don't think a lot of them are enjoying it right now.
Yeah, right. Well, and that may become a moot point if we pass term limits, which I think there's a very good chance we're going to. That's going to be a moot point because they're going to be out anyway.
And the question on term limits is who's going to fight it? Like who's going to put together a campaign?
The legislators can't. They'll be laughed at, right?
Yeah.
Right? Burgum can't because, he's got skin in the game. You need some independent group, and I don't know who that's going to be. Right, normally you would think like a group like the Chamber of Commerce, but they don't have a dog in this fight. So who's gonna fight against it? Nobody. It's gonna pass, right? And I don't think the vote. And we had this whole debate before, so but that's looming. But at some point you have to come to grips. I mean, at some point it's like you need thought leaders. Like you need to start a counter movement within the Republican Party that's going to push back on this. And maybe that's the solution. Is don't. Whatever John Hoeven does with the convention this year, that's going to be a short-term decision about John Hoeven winning re-election in 2022. But long-term, I think if people who are worried about what's happening in the Republican Party, you got to show up. To your point, Chad, about why aren't you guys packing these rooms, right? You need to get organized too. You need to fight for your party because it's being taken over by people that I think have the wrong priorities. I don't think that they have the right view of conservatism. I think they have the wrong priorities for our state, but they're taking over. And if you don't like that, do something about it.
But you know how hard it is to, the way folks use social media to attack people who they're against. I mean, it's a lot easier to focus on getting your kids to soccer practice and going to work every day and doing those things. And that's a problem. And I'm sure you've talked to as many Republicans as I
live in Minot. I live in Minot, which is the epicenter of this movement, yep. Right? And the way they took, I talk to Republicans in Minot all the time. People who've been involved in Republican politics in this city, in the state for a long time. And what they told me is we stopped going. We stopped going to district meetings because I was spending my Tuesday night getting screamed at, and I just didn't want to do it anymore. I'd rather, play with my grandkids or go to my kids' basketball game or something like that.
And I also think we forget about those long-term party members. I mean, if you've been a Republican for your whole life and you're 65, 70 years old, it's got to be hard to see what's going on here. I mean, your partisanship, what you believe in ideologically. I mean, I don't want to say it's like religion, but I mean, it's something about who you are. And then you see this institution just falling by the wayside. Do you fight? You drop out? I mean,
especially when you're that and you're thinking about retirement. And honestly, I a huge influence, and nobody really talks about this, but I think one of the big reasons why, this movement's been so successful in a lot of these districts, which by the way was kind of alluded to by Jason Heitkamp, who in what's that, District 25 now?
25, yeah.
25, yeah. So he didn't get the endorsement. But he was talking about the number of Republicans, like I guess they did proxy voting, where a lot of the Republicans who didn't show up to the district, were able to have somebody vote for them by proxy, which I don't, that's what he alleged. I don't know anything about that. That's kind of a new one on me. But I think a big factor is a lot of those older Republicans, they're retired now, and they're in Arizona while a lot of this stuff's going on. They're not going to come back to North Dakota in January or February to attend a district convention, when the weather is what it is. They're
when
down
the weather is February.
Right. Well, so they're down in Arizona. I think that's a huge factor in this.
Well, and if that proxy thing is true, that is bizarre, right? He alleged that somebody came there with 11 proxies plus his own vote and voted for 12.
But let's be clear that the source for that is Jason Heitkamp, who in that same video compared himself to Jesus Christ. So
yep.
I don't know. Maybe that one is worth some exploring. There may be an explanation there that is not Jason Heitkamp's explanation. But really, if we could bring it back to this video, and I don't want to read too much into a guy trying to effect a citizen's arrest on the Grand Forks City Council and our congressional delegation and Governor Doug Burgum and the executive branch of our entire state government for approving a corn milling plant that he doesn't like. The thing is at the end of just a truly bizarre rant, he got applause, right? There were people in that room, and not a small number of people in that room. And it was a crowded room because the Grand Forks City Council decided to do both the hate crime ordinance and the Fufang plan on the same meeting. So good job for you guys.
Knock it out.
Packed the room. Get it all out of the room in one horrible evening. But he got applause. And that's the problem, is that people who are clearly unserious, are completely unserious people, are getting like I don't want to say mainstream support, but not insignificant amounts of support. That is the crux of the problem.
Yeah, and I keep thinking about this Hoeven, Becker, to a certain extent, other races. We could ask Kirsten Baesler about how she feels about conventions. She's had some terrible times at conventions.
Yeah.
And it reminds me, when Senator Heitkamp got re-endorsed, there was a guy named Dustin Pyer who ran against her. And I remember because at the what was the state convention? I think the Republican convention was in Grand Forks that year. They had I think I wrote a blog post about it. They had somebody for Dustin Pyer they were circulating petitions at the Republican convention to put him on the primary ballot against Heitkamp, which I guess is smart, right? Republicans would love that. Well, I think to run as an independent, wasn't it?
Or maybe it was.
But he got like 15%. And I remember being in the room and how incredibly uncomfortable it was to think that 15% of the people that I'm next to are supporting this, and
well, let's get back. Michael Coachman, the citizen's arrest guy, he was on the statewide ballot. He ran a write-in campaign for governor in 2020. And it was promoted by Rick Becker, who obviously, had the long knives out for Doug Burgum. I don't think there's anyone in the world Rick Becker hates more than Doug Burgum. But, Becker's promoting it. He got 17,500. Well, I should say the write-ins, there were 17,500 write-ins, which is a very large number of write-ins. And I got to think the bulk of those went to Coachman, right? So
yeah. Now imagine if Coachman was on the ballot.
Yeah.
If his name was on the ballot, he probably would have got 50,000 votes.
Yeah. This is the part where I have to mention that Coachman's candidacy for Secretary of State was promoted by the North Dakota Democratic NPL, trying to triangulate.
Like the GOP collecting signatures for Dustin Pyer. I guess that makes sense,
I don't know
right?
that was the GOP. That was one of Dustin's volunteers, I guess, coming to the Republicans to get them to sign. And I don't know how many people signed. Yeah. I didn't sign, if you're wondering. I don't sign petitions.
I wasn't.
I don't sign petitions in general. But
really? Yeah. I sign petitions for every candidate, even if I disagree with them.
Do you?
Yeah, if they want to be on the ballot, they should be on the ballot.
I don't sign any of them. Well, I guess candidate petitions are different. I was thinking more like initiated measure petitions. I don't sign any.
Oh, I don't sign every initiated measure. Although, if you recall, I do trust the voters to make decisions for themselves.
Yeah. Although, given the subject matter of this last segment, I think we have to call that trust into.
I believe that's a real fair point, Rob.
Yes, that is a fair point. So that's where we're at. Everything's terrible, and it's all the people's fault. And all we have to offer you, listeners, is despair. I shouldn't say that. Actually, let's end on a hopeful note. I do think this time will pass. What I'm afraid of is that it's going to take some pain before we get there, and pain, whether it's manifested in, depending on how you look at it, if you're a conservative Republican, seeing the Dem NPL be brought up off the mat because we are endorsing and nominating completely unserious candidates. But more importantly, the pain where some of those candidates get into the legislature in the short term and focus the attention of our policymakers on, hot button culture war issues and not what really matters. Governing is actually, and this is one thing that drives me nuts about political rhetoric, governing is actually very complicated and very hard. It takes a lot of diligent work by a lot of very smart people to do it and to do it competently. And it doesn't just happen. Like I think we have been so comfortable both in North Dakota and as a country for so long that we take these institutions for granted. We kind of think that no matter what we do, at the end of the day, the roads will get plowed, the bridges will get fixed and everything will be fine. And that's not necessarily true. And what I'm afraid is that things are going to have to get bad before we get serious again.
But Rob, I would suggest that things aren't going to get better in North Dakota.
I also realized I just said that I was going to end on a positive note, and then I dropped that rhetorical bomb.
I'm going to not add a positive note. I also think things aren't going to get better for the North Dakota GOP until the National Party somewhat distances themselves from Trump. And I don't see that happening.
Well, it's not going to happen. I mean, they're censoring people for not being sufficiently loyal to Donald Trump. I mean, that's...
Well, and not to mention McCarthy endorsing Liz Cheney's opponent in Wyoming.
Yeah.
So as long as that sort of stuff is happening, I think it's going to be difficult. And I'm sure I've talked to so many a handful of Republicans in the last week or two that are just distraught. Like they don't know what to do. They're bummed out. They go to these conventions. It makes them feel like
what am I a part of? Where do I fit here?
Where do I fit?
Yeah. I have, and I should say this. I mean, I'm I guess a cultural Republican. I'm not a member. I don't think it's appropriate for me to be paying dues to a political party. So I'm not a member. I don't participate in that way. I'm not a delegate. I don't do any of that stuff. I'm an observer.
Rob, if you were a Democrat, they don't make you pay to participate, unlike the Republican Party.
I don't have a problem with that. I think if you want to be a member and have a say in how in an organization's candidates or leadership or whatever, you ought to be a member. Paying some reasonable dues, I don't think is a bad thing. The thing about getting candidates to pay for ballot access is that's a different matter, and that's a whole other show that I think we've actually already done. So, on that note, we'll bring this one to a close. Thank you, of course, everyone for listening, and Chad, thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks for introducing me.
Want more political news like this? Visit inforum.news/port to get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Don't wait. Get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now.